Hi, AP scholars. Let's jump into topic 4.4. It's the banking and the expansion of the money supply. This is out there. Most people think they have an idea of what a banking system is and how it works, and most of them are dead wrong. So I'm going to try to work through this. It's going to get a little crazy, but bear with me. We'll come back to it time and time again. This is one of those key mastery concepts that you just got to know. So let's get into it. First of all, the banking basics and the Federal Reserve. When I talk about the Fed or the Federal Reserve, I'm also talking about the central bank. They are one and the same. The Federal Reserve is the United States central bank. So you might want to notate that. We have, and every nation in the world has, a fractional banking system. What's a fractional banking system? This means that all of the money that you put in the bank, only a portion of it is required by federal law to be set aside. And that wasn't even required up and until the rush on the banks after in 1929, after the stock market crash. All these people ran to withdraw their money because they're worried about the stock market. When they got there, the bank didn't have their stinking money, right? Because the banks just took the money and lent it back out to somebody else. That's how they make profit. So we then instituted that a certain amount of it had to be set aside. But before then, banks didn't have to set any money aside. In fact, here's how a bank works. You go in, you deposit your money. You think the money stays there, but it doesn't. The bank then takes your money and will give somebody else a loan from that money. That person will then take that loan and go buy something else. That's something else, person they purchase that something else from, they get money, income, which is actually your money, and then they will deposit that in a bank, and now your money will be in two places. You've just created more money from the same money, but there's no additional money out there. There's no like physical currency. It was just an idea. I gave it an IOU, and this person now used my IOU to buy something else. And on that goes. That person has that money in that account. The bank takes a portion of it, sets it aside, takes the rest of it, lends it out, and that person then gets income. They put it in another bank, and on it goes. It's chaos. Why? Well, this is how banks make money. This is the incentive for banks to protect your money, and it works just fine as long as not everybody comes to the bank at the same time. In fact, if you go to withdrawal funds of over $5,000, I believe it might be lower for some banks, $5,000, you'll have to wait because the bank doesn't have your money. They'll say, hey, we'll put in the request, come back tomorrow, and we'll have your money for you. And then they're calling the Federal Reserve or the regional bank and saying, hey, we need $5,000 on a rush over here so we can pay out this customer. But if you think about it, it's pretty ingenious because not everybody's going to need their money at the exact same time, right? Unless there's a stock market crash. That's probably not going to happen. And so the banks can lend this money out. They make money off the interest, and then they can pay people when their needs arise. That's the idea. Okay, so that's the fractional banking system on the surface of it. The Federal Reserve is the central bank that helps manage that fractional banking system. It is the great regulator, meaning that all the banks in the United States are regulated by the Federal Reserve or whatever that nation's central bank is. They set a reserve ratio. That's the percentage of money the banks are required by federal law, Federal Reserve law, to set aside just in case there's a rush on the banks to say, hey, we're not lending out all of your money. A portion of it we're putting over here into our reserves so that when you come to withdraw it, we'll have it for you. Okay, that's the reserve ratio. Oh, I just said that. It's the percentage of deposits that are put in the bank that can't be lent out by the bank. So it regulates them a little bit. For example, if you put $1,000 into the bank and there's currently a 10% reserve ratio, 900 of those dollars become excess reserves, meaning I can lend them out. But 100 of those dollars has to be set aside as a part of our requirement. Like we cannot touch this, we cannot lend it. And that creates sort of the base that banks have access to. Okay, what else about it? Well, the Federal Reserve is made up of a couple of things. This really isn't that important, but I think talking about what the Fed is, kind of, and central banks are, kind of unveils the mystery of it all. And we're like, okay, that's how it functions. They are run by a board of governors, which is 7 individuals. They have 12 central banks. I should say the board of governors is headed by the Fed head, or the head of the Federal Reserve. These are economists. If you decide to major in economics, you can work yourself up to the very tippity top, which is the Fed head. There are 12 central banks across the United States, and each of those central banks holds a region. The central bank for region number 4 is in Cleveland, Ohio. So you can go and visit the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, Ohio. Pretty cool. These are nonprofits, meaning that the banks aren't actually supposed to make any money off of this. They are quasi public, which means that they are providing a service for the public as a result of their activity. So this is not there's no profit incentives here. There's no like tiered salary schedules for people based on their performance. This is a government job. The FOMC is the most important part of the Federal Reserve. It's the uh, Federal Open Market Committee. That's what the C stands for. Federal Open Market Committee. And what they do is they buy and sell bonds to change the supply of money. And this is the thing we really hone in here on this unit, is change the supply of money. So that's the FOMC, or the Federal Open Market Committee, that buys and sells bonds to change the supply of money. Okay, what are the powers of the Federal Reserve? I have a few. And again, there's only one of these that's really important. They issue currency. So all of the currency that you have has a little stamp from the Federal Reserve on it. They set and hold reserves. So when you put money into reserves, it goes to the Federal Reserve, or these central banks, where they house all of those required reserve monies. They give short-term loans out to banks. Think about it. All of the banks put their reserves in the same place. So when you go to withdraw that $5,000 and they have you wait, they not only have money to, or access to, the reserves for that bank, but they have access to reserves for all banks, and they can make the choice of where that $5,000 comes from based on their understanding of the market. Okay, so they have a big pool of money to pull from. They take care of check collection. You think about it, a bank doesn't call somebody up and put, if you deposit a check in Florida and you live in Ohio, there's not going to be a Mack truck that's filled with that money that drives down there. The central bank will simply do an accounting adjustment. They'll take the money down for the Ohio bank, they'll push the money up for the Florida bank on that high level. They are the fiscal agent, which means that they participate and act on behalf of the government. Whatever purchases the government's making, they make those purchases for them. Whatever savings the government's putting together, they make those savings for them. Issuance of bonds, all those things are done by the Federal Reserve. It's like the personal bank for the government. Of course, they regulate banks. We talked about that. And most importantly, is they control the supply of money. And in doing so, control interest rates, which have an impact on investment, aggregate demand, long-term, long-run economic growth. You're seeing where all this goes. Okay, so how does fractional banking work? Here we go. The process works like this. Deposits come in. When that deposit comes in, a percentage of that deposit is set aside in required reserves, as dictated by the Federal Reserve, or the central bank. They decide how much money gets set aside based on risk, basically. The remaining, we call those excess reserves, can be lent out by the bank. Then those loans are used to purchase. Think about it. When I take out a loan, I don't take out a loan to save it. I take out a loan so I can buy that car, or buy that house, or buy that Taco Bell franchise. I don't know what you're doing. And then more deposits come in. Portion of that money set aside. The rest of it is lent out. That person then spends it. They put that deposit in another bank. Repeat, 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 repeat. So let's walk through the creation of a bank together. This is a little bit of accounting, and it is a requirement for what we're doing. So you will have to be able to do this. So let me give you a brief overview of accounting. Accounting has assets and liabilities. Assets are always going to be on your left. Liabilities are always going to be on your right. And an easy way to think about this is assets are things that you own. Liabilities are things that you owe own versus owe. So assets have value, liabilities are a debt that need to be paid back. So let's say a bank opens up and it collects $20,000 of investment, goes to people and says, hey, I'm starting a bank. It's going to be awesome. If you get in on the ground floor, here are the perks that you get. Give me your money. And wealthy benefactors say, okay, here's your 20 grand. So you take that 20 grand and you go and buy equipment. How do we notate this? First of all, you owe that money back to that person eventually. Maybe not right away. They might be nice about it. But eventually, you're going to owe that person money back. So here, I'm going to put $20,000 under owner's equity, meaning I owe that money back. At any time, those people who invested in my company now own a portion of my company. They can demand their money back, and I have to give it to them. So that's a liability. I owe them that money. But that money is also now able to be used. So I go and I buy, let's say I buy a bunch of equipment. So I put $20,000 in equipment. Notice I owe something, but I also own something with that money, right? So I have an asset and a liability. In fact, every asset is always going to equal a liability. These two sides are equal. Liabilities plus owner equity equals assets every single time. Okay, so I have $20,000. I bought equipment with it, but I owe that back eventually, and I can pay them back by selling that equipment off if I want, right? So that's how you do it. So far, so good. That's my first entry. Now I've got those entries, they carried over for me. Let's say the bank accepts $10,000 of deposits and the reserve ratio is 10%, meaning that out of that $10,000, 10% has to be set aside by federal law. If the bank doesn't do that, they're in violation, they can be shut down, they can be fined, people can get fired, it's bad, right? So let's just assume that banks are always going to follow the rules here. What happens? Well, first, whenever I take on new deposits, I owe that back. Think about it as from a bank perspective. I take those deposits. Those people can demand that money back anytime. They can take out a withdrawal. They can go to an ATM, or they can call me up, or they can show up at the bank and say, give me my money. And you have to give it to them. So it is owed. So I take that $10,000, that's right here. I owe them that money. But I'm going to assume that I get to hang on to the money for a while. So what do I do with it? Well, there are two places deposits can go: required reserves and excess reserves. So I always start with required reserves because it's easier for me to think about. So if I'm doing required reserves, I jump over here. 10% of that $10,000 is required. So I can plug that into a calculator, 10,000 by 0.1 times 0.1, or I can just say, hey, I know 10% of $10,000 is 1,000. So this bank, by federal law, has to take $1,000 and put it to the side. They can't touch it. Which means how much money do they have left of those deposits? Well, they got $10,000 of deposits, $1,000 in required. What they have left are their excess reserves. So this is going to be $9,000 right here. Quick check. Did I add up? Well, over here I have $30,000. Over here I have $20,000 equipment, $9,000 excess reserves, $1,000. Yeah, that's $30,000. Assets equals liabilities. I'm doing it right. Notice I now have 1,000 I can't touch, but I have 9,000 I can touch. We call these loanable funds. Loanable funds. My excess reserves are the funds that I actually can lend out. So what am I going to do? If I'm a bank trying to make profit, I got to pay people back eventually. I want to do well. What am I going to do? I'm going to take those excess reserves and I'm going to lend them out. So step number 3 here, keep going. The bank begins lending. Now, unless you're told otherwise, you can assume that the bank lends all of its excess reserves when it says that the bank is lending. So I'm not just going to lend 1,000 and keep some in excess. We assume that they loan up. They send them all out to loans because that's how they make money. So how do I do this if the bank is lending all of their money? Well, how much can they lend? They can lend all 9,000. So this is going to go to zero. I'm going to get rid of all of those reserves, and they're going to become loans. People come in, they give me an application. I say, hey, I think I can make money off of you, and I give them the loan. So I now have no more excess reserves. I now have loans, and those loans have value to me because I'm going to get paid back that plus interest in the future. Am I still balanced? Yeah. I simply made the change on one side of this. So it's 30,000, 1,000 plus 0 plus 9,000 plus 20,000 is 30,000. I'm still balanced up. Notice that transaction. Excess reserves become loans. They start as loanable funds. They end as actual loans when the bank gives them out. Okay? All right, let's keep going. Now, let's say you take on more deposits. Okay, so notice all that carried over. I take on more deposits. So I'm going to take on $4,000 more deposits. Banks always want more deposits. This is why they have those incentive programs. They say, hey, we'll give you $100 in your checking account if you open it up here. They want your deposits because that's how they make money. So these checkable deposits, $10,000, are going to go up because I now have $4,000 of additional deposits. So this is going to be $14,000. Now, how much of that money had to be put aside into required reserves? Well, there are a couple of ways I can do this. I can take just 10% of 14,000 and say this needs to be 1,400. Or I go over here, which I think is easiest, and I say, okay, 10% of this has to be set aside. What's 10% of 4,000? Of course, it's 400. So my required reserves are going to become not 1,000 anymore, but 1,400. And just a quick check, is 1,400, is that 10% of my checkable deposits? Yeah, my checkable deposits are 14,000. My required reserves are 1,400. Perfect. Okay, where did the rest of that money go? Well, where did the other 3,600 wind up? Well, we know if I got new money, that money becomes excess reserves if I don't have to set it aside. I want to loan as a bank, so that jumps right into my loanable funds. So loanable funds go from 0 to 3,600. Why 3,600? A couple of ways I can find this. I can add all this up versus this and see how much I have left over. So it'd be 1,400, 9,000, 20,000. Okay, I have 3,600 left. That's what goes into excess reserves. Or, easiest way I think, is I put that 400 aside, and then what's left from that $4,000 deposit, of course, it's 3,600, and that's what goes into my excess reserves. Okay, not so bad. All right, let's keep going. So I got that new deposit. Now somebody makes a withdrawal. People can take their money. What's going to happen? Well, when somebody takes their money, I don't owe them that money anymore. So my checkable deposits are going to fall. I don't owe them that. But then I have to give them that money out of my excess reserves, right? That's the money I actually have. So if I lent it all out, I don't have it. I have to call up the Federal Reserve or another bank, which we'll talk about, and get that money. But for now, we actually have it because we just took on a new deposit. So check it out. $1,000 of withdrawal. So I come here. It's not going to be 14,000 anymore. I now only owe, let me change to red, I only owe 13,000 because I'm paying this person out. All right, so I only have 13,000. I don't owe that person that $1,000 anymore. That's what that is saying. Okay, so what happens to my reserves? Well, I know that my reserves are going to go down by 1,000. Okay, so if my reserves go down by 1,000, then my excess reserves, that's where I have to take it from. That's the only actual money I have to maneuver, are going to go down to 2,600, down by 1,000. And then I jump over here. What are my required reserves now? Well, my required reserves are only 1,300. How do I know they're 1,300? They're 1,300 because that's 10% of this required reserves. So 100 of this is taken here. I'm sorry, this should be 27. That's why we do it the other way, 2,700. 100 of this is going to be taken away from required reserves. I don't have to own that anymore. The rest of it, which would be 900, is going to be taken from my excess reserves. So 3,600 minus that 900 gets me to 2,700. Now, how do I check to make sure I got this right? I just add all this up. So this is 33,000. This is 29 plus 4, or 33,000 Denzel Washington. I did it. Right? Okay. That's really all it is. We'll do this a lot of times, but a deposit comes in, there's certain steps you have to take. A withdrawal happens, there's certain steps you have to take. A money is lent out, there's certain steps you have to take. And those are pretty much the only things that can happen. We're going to keep it to these central kind of 6 items. So you can memorize what is in the liabilities and what's in the asset side. And just remember that they always, always, always have to be balanced. Okay, so oftentimes you'll be given something like this. Nice little balance sheet here. You know all of these things. I don't know what just happened. You know all of these things well. Notice we have our loans, we have reserves, we have treasury bonds, we have demand deposits and owner's equity. Bonds are just another thing you can do with your money. I can buy bonds instead of lending it out. Reserves, we know, can be broken down in required and excess reserves. Sometimes they put them all together into reserves. If this bank is currently holding no excess reserves, meaning all of these reserves are required, right? So we only have 2 things we can do reserves, require them or have excess. This says there's no excess. What's my reserve ratio if that's true? Remember, my reserve ratio is a percentage of demand or checkable deposits. And so I know my reserves are 500, required reserves. My deposits are 5,000. 500 divided by 5,000 is going to kick out an interest rate of 10%. Now, if none of this makes sense, don't panic. Do the Khan Academy. Excuse me. We'll come together and we'll work through this together and we'll do several examples. This is going to be some pretty heavy lifting. Think of like original demand and supply, how much lifting we had to do, and we're just getting to understand those concepts. The same is true here. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we will get there together. Thank you, friends. That's all for this segment. We will do several examples in class. Until then, peace to you